The wood's secret. Lucy had always loved the outdoors, and the thick forest behind her new home was a perfect place to explore. She often ventured deep into the woods, captivated by the serene beauty of nature. One day, as she wandered further than usual, she stumbled upon a peculiar tree with carvings all over its bark. The carvings resembled ancient symbols and cryptic messages. Curiosity got the best of her, and she traced her fingers over the markings. As she did, she felt a sudden chill, as if the air around her had frozen. The sounds of the forest seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie silence. Lucy looked around, sensing something was wrong. The forest no longer felt welcoming. It felt watchful. She hurriedly turned to leave, but the path she had come from was gone. The trees had shifted, forming a wall around her. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. She ran in different directions, only to find herself back at the same tree every time. The symbols on the tree seemed to pulse with a life of their own, glowing faintly in the dim light. Desperate, Lucy called for help, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. The temperature dropped further, and she could see her breath misting in the air. Then, she noticed something moving among the trees. Shadowy figures, barely visible, watching her. They were tall, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed with a sinister light. One of the figures stepped forward, and Lucy felt an overwhelming dread. It spoke in a voice that echoed in her mind rather than her ears. "You have disturbed the sacred grounds. Now you belong to the forest." The ground beneath her feet started to shake, and the symbols on the tree flared brightly. Lucy tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. It felt like the earth itself was holding her in place. The shadowy figures began to close in, their eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. As they reached out, Lucy felt a sharp pain in her chest. She looked down to see her skin cracking, turning into bark. Her screams echoed in the empty forest as her body transformed, becoming one with the tree. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the shadowy figures merging into the trees, their glowing eyes fading. The forest was silent once more, the only trace of Lucy being the new set of carvings on the old tree. A warning to anyone who might wander too far. The stolen time. Emma had always been fascinated by old clocks. She loved their intricate designs and the way they marked the passage of time. When she found an antique pocket watch at a flea market, she couldn't resist buying it. The watch was beautiful, with ornate engravings and a chain that looked like it had seen centuries pass. As soon as she held it, Emma felt a strange connection. It was as if the watch had chosen her. She brought it home and placed it on her nightstand, admiring its craftsmanship. That night, she wound the watch and set it next to her bed before falling asleep. At exactly midnight, the watch started ticking loudly, waking Emma up. She reached for it, intending to quiet the noise, but as soon as she touched it, the world around her seemed to shift. The ticking grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. She felt dizzy, and the room began to blur. When the world came back into focus, Emma found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. It was a grand ballroom, filled with people dressed in elegant, old-fashioned clothing. They danced gracefully to the music of a string quartet, completely unaware of her presence. Confused and scared, Emma tried to speak to them, but no one seemed to notice her. She spotted a large clock on the wall, its hands moving backward. Panic surged through her as she realized she was trapped in a different time. Desperate to return home, she searched for the watch, but it was nowhere to be found. The more she looked, the more the people around her started to change. Their faces became gaunt, eyes hollow, and their movements jerky, like marionettes on strings. The room darkened, and the music warped into a haunting melody. Emma's heart raced as she felt an invisible force pulling her towards the clock. The people around her turned their heads, their lifeless eyes fixing on her. They began to chant in a language she didn't understand, and the force pulling her grew stronger. She struggled against it, but her feet moved involuntarily. As she was dragged closer to the clock, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows. A tall, thin man with a sinister grin. He held the pocket watch in his hand, and as he wound it, the hands of the large clock spun faster. "Time is precious," the man said, his voice cold and hollow. "And you've stolen it." With those words, the clock struck 12, and Emma felt a searing pain in her chest. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled apart, as if her very essence was being torn from her body. She screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the man's twisted smile as darkness consumed her. Emma woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat. The pocket watch lay on her nightstand, ticking softly. She quickly checked the time. It was exactly midnight. Shaken, she threw the watch into a drawer and tried to calm her racing heart. But as she lay there, she noticed something strange. Her hands looked older, her skin wrinkled. She ran to the mirror and gasped. She had aged years overnight. The watch had stolen her time, and she knew it wasn't finished yet. The silent auction. Max had never believed in the supernatural, but he loved collecting oddities and curiosities. One day, he received an invitation to an exclusive auction, known only to a select few collectors. Intrigued, he decided to attend. The event was held in a dimly lit warehouse, filled with bizarre and unique items. As he browsed through the lots, Max's attention was drawn to a peculiar mirror. Unlike any other, it had no reflection. The glass was pitch black, absorbing all light. The auctioneer, an elderly man with a mysterious aura, described it as the mirror of oblivion, claiming it showed not reflections but the essence of one's soul. Max scoffed at the idea but decided to bid on it, thinking it would be a fascinating addition to his collection. He won the mirror easily. No one else seemed interested. After the auction, the auctioneer approached him, handing over the mirror with a warning. "Be careful what you seek in its depths." Max shrugged off the warning and brought the mirror home. That night, after setting it up in his study, he decided to test the old man's claim. He stood before the mirror, staring into the black void. First, nothing happened, but then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. Faint outlines of a figure took form, growing clearer with each passing moment. To his horror, Max realized he was looking at himself, but it wasn't just a reflection. The figure in the mirror wore a twisted, malevolent grin, its eyes glowing with a dark, unnatural light. Max tried to move, but he felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away. The figure began to speak, its voice a distorted version of Max's own. It revealed secrets he had buried deep, fears he had never voiced. It mocked him, showing visions of his past failures and regrets. Max's heart pounded as the mirror continued to reveal the darkest corners of his soul. Desperate to escape, Max tried to turn away, but his reflection moved with him, stepping out of the mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. It had become real, a dark doppelganger. The room grew cold, and shadows deepened as the figure approached him. Max backed away, but the doppelganger was relentless. It reached out, and Max felt an icy chill as their hands touched. A surge of pain shot through him, and he felt his strength drain away. The doppelganger's form solidified, becoming more human-like, while Max felt himself grow weaker. He stumbled, falling to the floor, and looked up to see the doppelganger standing over him, now fully formed. It looked exactly like him, but with a cold, soulless expression. The doppelganger smiled, a cruel twist of its lips, and stepped over Max, walking towards the door. Max tried to call out, but no sound came. His vision blurred, and he felt his consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw was his own body lying on the floor, lifeless, as the doppelganger left the room, leaving him trapped in the void of the mirror, forever silent. The forgotten room. Jake and his friends had a knack for exploring abandoned buildings. One day, they came across an old, forgotten hotel on the outskirts of town. Despite its decrepit state, the building had an eerie charm that piqued their curiosity. They entered the hotel, carefully making their way through the dusty, decaying halls. As they wandered deeper into the hotel, they stumbled upon a door that seemed different from the others. It was small, barely noticeable, and covered in intricate carvings. Unlike the other doors, this one looked untouched by time. Jake, feeling a strange compulsion, reached out and opened it. Inside, they found a small, perfectly preserved room. The contrast with the rest of the building was startling. The room was decorated like a child's playroom from decades past. There were old toys scattered about, a small table with a tea set, and faded wallpaper with whimsical patterns. On one wall hung a painting of a young girl, her face hauntingly beautiful but with an unsettling expression. As Jake and his friends explored the room, they felt an odd sense of nostalgia mixed with unease. One of them, Lisa, picked up an old doll from the floor. The doll's eyes were closed, but as she held it, they suddenly snapped open, revealing a lifelike, piercing gaze. Startled, she dropped it, and the room seemed to grow colder. Suddenly, they heard soft humming, like a lullaby, coming from somewhere in the room. The group looked around, but there was no one else there. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature continued to drop. The door they had entered through suddenly slammed shut, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The painting of the girl seemed to come alive, her eyes following them around the room. The humming turned into whispering, and then into faint cries of children. Jake noticed a small, old-fashioned phonograph in the corner. He approached it, and as he did, the whispers became clearer, like voices from another time. He cranked the handle, and the device began to play a haunting melody, mixed with the faint sound of children's laughter. The walls of the room seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was distorting. The whispers grew louder, now clearly the voices of children calling out for help. The group realized with horror that the room was not just a forgotten playroom. It was a trap, a place where lost souls were bound. Lisa screamed as the doll she had dropped suddenly moved, its head turning to face her. Its mouth opened, and a chilling voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The room's atmosphere grew oppressive, and the shadows on the walls started to take shape, forming the outlines of ghostly children. The children reached out to them, their faces twisted with sorrow and anger. The group backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The door remained firmly shut, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The whispers turned into wails, and the room shook as if the very building was groaning under the weight of countless trapped souls. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jake grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window. But instead of shattering, the glass seemed to absorb the impact, the surface rippling like water. The room began to warp and twist, the furniture and toys melting and reforming in grotesque shapes. As the chaos intensified, the painting of the girl shifted. Her expression changed from sad to malevolent, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. The ghostly children surrounded the group, their cold hands grasping at them, pulling them towards the center of the room. Just when it seemed like there was no escape, Jake noticed a small keyhole near the base of the painting. He fumbled in his pockets, pulling out an old, ornate key they had found earlier in the hotel. Desperately, he inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The room suddenly fell silent, the shadows dissipating. The painting reverted to its original form, and the door swung open. The group rushed out, gasping for air as they stumbled back into the dilapidated hallway. They could still hear faint whispers behind them, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. They didn't stop running until they were out of the hotel and back into the daylight. As they caught their breath, they turned to look at the building. It seemed as if it was just another abandoned structure, but they knew better. The room, the whispers, and the children, none of it had been an illusion. Jake looked at the key in his hand, now cold and dull. He threw it into the bushes, vowing never to speak of what they had experienced. They left the hotel behind, but the memory of the forgotten room and its trapped souls would haunt them forever.